The future of the European Union remains one of the leading topics after last weekend's European parliamentary elections.
With far-right parties gaining power, could this spell a period of instability? Could Hungarian EU presidency this July lead to further divide? Joining us now to talk about this topic is Dr. Catherine Fieschi, political analyst specializing in populist and authoritarian politics and a fellow at the Robert Schuman Center at the EUY in Florence. Good evening.
Good evening.
So the first question would be how the results of the European election affect the future of cooperation between European Union countries, because we know that many of those have very different priorities and very different ideas about the European Union.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I think that that these elections, with the gains for parties on the far right, definitely spell a period of change for the European Parliament. It's important, as many have reminded us, to keep in mind that the center groups, the two main center-left and center-right groups, continue to be the two largest parties, but it's true that there's been a growth on the right. I think what's most important, though, in terms of cooperation between European countries going forward is much more the impact of the scores on domestic politics. For example, we can see that Giorgia Meloni, who is currently leading the ECR nationalist sovereignist group in the European Parliament, she has come out very much strengthened from these elections. And we also know that Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National have come out so strengthened from these elections that President Macron has called a snap election for parliamentary elections in France at the end of this year. So I think that, the domestic consequences and the kinds of balance of powers that we will see at the national level are what is likely to have an impact in the European Council, even more so than in the European Parliament.
It became painfully obvious after this weekend's EU parliamentary elections that there is a big divide and a sort of a polarization when it comes to the political landscape on the continent. Some may worry that some of the more controversial MEPs could potentially lead to European Union being broken from within. Do you think this could be the case or not?
So I think that some of the current MEPs and certainly some of the parties of the current MEPs are definitely looking to change the union from within. To some extent, one could argue that that's been the case for Orban's Fidesz, for Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy, and so on and so forth. This has already been the case. But I also think that, there are a number of more controversial MEPs that are being appointed, that have been elected. But to be honest, I don't think that these controversial MEPs are really the ones that are going to make a difference. This is not the first time that we've seen this. In 2022, for example, there was an MEP from the French Rassemblement National that made all sorts of disparaging remarks against minorities. There have others that have made disparaging remarks against LGBTQ movements and so on and so forth. I actually don't think, however unpleasant these people are, that they have very much of an impact. I don't think that controversy, unfortunately, is what disqualifies these parties.
Mm-hmm. But still, the question remains whether this growing number of far-right MEPs. Just to say, MEPs who put the country's interest in the first place. That this trend would lead to somehow will somehow affect the regional groupings of EU countries, such as the Weimar Triangle, for example.
Yes, and I think that that's very much the case. I think that we have to worry about these regional groupings being destabilized. We have to worry about the Weimar Triangle simply because we have a weakened President Macron and a weakened Chancellor Scholz. So out of the three in the Weimar Triangle, two of them in many ways have had their legitimacy strongly dented by these elections. Scholz by the AfD and Macron by Le Pen's party, or Bardela's Rassemblement National. So I do think that, I'm not minimizing the impact of these parties. I think that they will, over time, very much, they will gradually change the balance of power inside the European Parliament. And that perhaps more importantly, they will start to frame the way in which the possibilities, right, is imagined inside Europe. There will be topics that simply will not have as much currency. We know, for example, that the Green Deal is something that is going to be much less prominent in this coming legislature than before. We know, for example, that large trade and commercial agreements are also not going to be favored by these parties, and therefore will probably suffer in the process. And we also know that many of these parties have very different attitudes toward support for Ukraine. So Law and Justice and Meloni support Ukraine, but we know that Marine Le Pen's party actually has been very silent on it, and she has been in the past associated with support to Putin and also support from Putin to her. So I think that these are the lines that we are going to see emerge, and these are the contentious points that we are going to see emerge. The saving grace is that there are dividing lines between these parties, and it will not necessarily be easy for them to come to an agreement between them.
Oh, they're negotiating. They're negotiating right now.
Absolutely, they're negotiating right now, and in light of what's going on in France, I can tell you that they are negotiating also on the national level. But I think that there is fragility there. I think that we can pin our hopes on the fact that that these lines are lines that will continue to divide them. But it's obvious that because they have scored so well in these elections, they have huge incentives in trying to find a way to get along together.
One of the major shifts which are about to take place in the coming weeks and months is Hungary's EU presidency. And I was wondering if this presidency by Hungary could actually somewhat amplify the voices of the far-right parties and their stance in the EU Parliament.
Well, I think that the Hungarian presidency is going to be a really big challenge. I mean, we now have all the parties who are trying to support Ukraine on behalf of Europe, struggling to get things done before July. We're going to see some of this in the G7 in the next couple of days, where someone like Macron will probably try to get as much done, particularly on the interest from the frozen assets, for example, as much done before the elections here in France at the end of the month. So there's all sorts of deadlines to be met, including the Hungarian presidency. I think, to be honest, that what is going to make potentially more of a difference than the Hungarian presidency is actually the American elections. And when we have the results of that, and, should Trump be reelected, that might be, I think, a bigger tipping point than the Hungarian presidency. But there's no doubt that Orban will try and use this, at least as a stage, to amplify those voices, as you quite rightly said, and possibly to get, a number of, if not of things through, then certainly to act as a drag and to slow down some of the other business of the European Union.
Right. The last question would be about the future of the far-right parties, because now we can clearly see that there's a sort of a protest against the current policies of the EU, what we observe in Europe. But can these far-right parties that race to power hold on to it? Or do they have to somehow adapt and evolve to become mainstream parties after all? Because I guess that's what we already observe in France, right? The Rassemblement National is changing its narrative. It's not as sharp as it used to be only a few years ago.
I think that's right. There's a couple of points there that are really important. One is, if we think of the Rassemblement National being less sharp than a few years ago, one has to wonder how much of this is superficial and how much of this is real. And in a sense, Macron's snap election and taking the risk of bringing far more Rassemblement National MPs into the National Assembly, are a way of clarifying this. If they were to get more power, would they water down their stance? We've also seen this in the Netherlands, for example, where Wilders has had to really water down his stance in order to come to a government agreement. We've seen Giorgia Meloni certainly come across as much more constructive than one might have anticipated, certainly on the European scene, even though she's maintained, quite an ultra-conservative and very right-wing stance at the domestic level. So it's hard to tell how these parties would behave when they are in power, and it very much depends on how constrained or unconstrained they are, whether they're in coalition, like the PVV, like Giorgia Meloni, or whether, in fact, when they're not in coalition, and we look at somebody like Orban, there was no watering of the stance, on his part. So I think that, these are all good questions. So far, we've seen that coming close to power does actually temper some of the worst aspects of these parties. But on the other hand, we've also seen that the closer these parties come to power, the more they tempt the mainstream or center-right further to the right. So at the very least, one could argue that their impact is to move the cursor to the right of the right, if you like.
So as always, we'll just have to wait and see.
Indeed. Thank you so much for bringing us more information on the winds of change sweeping through Europe. Catherine Fieschi, political analyst, fellow of the Robert Schuman Center in Florence, Italy. Thank you so much.